You never think this will happen to you. When you dedicate your life to protecting the law. When you earn the respect of your colleagues and the trust of the community. But sometimes the world doesn't see inside, only the outside. And for David Harper, this reality hit much harder than he could have imagined. The summer sun was rising over Clearwater Park. Sunbeams filtered through the branches of the old oak trees lining the walking paths. David sat on a bench next to the fountain, his dark jacket neatly folded beside him, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up to his elbows. On his lap was a manila folder containing the case files he had been reviewing during his lunch break. The city's noise seemed distant here, replaced by the gentle murmur of water and the occasional chirping of birds. It was an incredibly peaceful environment for David. He took a sip from his coffee cup, his eyes scanning the documents, numbers, dates, witness statements. Everything had to be perfect. David had built his career on precision, on being meticulous about every detail. As a senior investigator with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, he couldn't afford to make mistakes. Even the smallest error could ruin everything. His job required him to be extremely careful, but today, precision didn't matter. Across the park, Officer Greg Sullivan leaned against his patrol car, arms crossed over his chest. His eyes scanned the area with the habit of someone who had been on patrol for 15 years. He took pride in knowing his neighborhood well, in noticing problems before they started. And right now, something felt off. He had this feeling that something was about to happen. Does this ever happen to you? Have you ever felt like you could sense something was about to happen? A black man in a suit, sitting alone, looking at papers. Greg's jaw tightened. He had heard about a series of burglaries in the area. Businessmen had been targeted, documents stolen. The description was vague, but it was enough. Greg called it a gut feeling. Instinct. He moved away from the car and started walking toward David. David noticed the movement out of the corner of his eye. He looked up briefly, saw the police officer approaching, and turned his attention back to the file. He had encountered enough situations to know when someone was sizing him up, but he also knew he had nothing to hide. So he remained calm, kept his hands visible, and waited. But there was something he didn't know. The person opposite him would treat him differently. Greg stopped a few meters away and said, "Good day." Greg's voice was relaxed but authoritative. He didn't lose his seriousness in any way. He seemed ready to make a move at any moment. David looked up and met his eyes. "Good day, officer," he replied. Greg's gaze fell on the file in David's lap. "What are you working on?" he asked. There was a suspicious look in his eyes. David slowly closed the folder and placed his hand on it. "Just some work. Nothing exciting," he replied calmly but firmly. Greg nodded, though unconvinced. "May I ask what kind of work?" he asked again. David's expression didn't change, but inside he felt the familiar weight of judgment settle upon him. He had encountered this before, being stopped, questioned, looked at with suspicion. It didn't matter that he was a federal agent. It didn't matter that he had served his country honorably. The only thing that mattered in moments like this was the color of his skin, and it bothered him deeply. He had been subjected to this kind of discrimination at every stage of his life. "I'm with the FBI," David said, his voice calm but firm. Greg's eyes narrowed. He didn't believe him. "FBI, huh? Do you have any ID to prove it?" The questions kept coming. David took a slow breath. He knew his rights. He knew he didn't have to show ID just for sitting in a park. But he also knew what could happen if he refused. Things could get worse. Words could turn into action. Actions could turn into something much worse. He was aware of everything that could happen to him. "Have you ever been treated this way before? Am I under arrest?" David asked, his tone measured. Whatever happened, he was trying to defuse the situation and remain calm. Greg got angry. There was that calmness again, that fearlessness. It made him uneasy. "If you don't cooperate, you will be arrested. I received a report of suspicious activity in this area, and you fit that description," he replied. But who knew what his real intentions were? David's jaw tightened. "What is that description?" he asked. Greg didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer and put his hand on his belt where his baton was. "I want you to stand up and show me your ID. Now," he said, almost like giving an order. The atmosphere was tense, and things that shouldn't happen could happen. David thought about resisting for a moment. He could defend his rights, refuse to comply, but he had seen too many situations spiral out of control. He had researched too many cases where a simple stop led to deadly consequences. So he had to make a choice, and he made it. Without a word, David slowly and carefully reached into his coat pocket. He took out his wallet and handed it to Greg. Greg took the wallet and opened it. He looked at the license, then at David, then back at the license. The name meant nothing to him. David Harper. It seemed like an ordinary name. But Greg hadn't experienced the shock of his life yet. Everything had its time. "Stand up," Greg ordered, stepping back to make room for David. David sighed inwardly, but obeyed. He rose from the bench slowly and deliberately. He kept his hands visible, not wanting to give Greg any reason to feel threatened, because he was acutely aware of what could happen to him. "Turn around," said Greg, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. David felt a momentary flash of anger, but he suppressed it. He turned around and allowed Greg to handcuff him without resistance. The cold metal bit into his wrists, and he could feel the eyes of passers-by on him. People were watching. People were judging. And in their eyes, he was just another black man being arrested. The other people on the street were looking at him with judgmental eyes. Greg grabbed David's arm and started leading him toward the patrol car. David didn't say a word. His mind had already moved on to the next steps. He wasn't worried about himself. He knew who he was, and he knew this cop would soon find out too. But he couldn't shake off his exhaustion, the weariness that came from knowing that despite everything he was still seen as nothing more than a suspect. Being a suspect was a little hard to take. It was very difficult to be treated like this for no reason at all. When they reached the car, Greg opened the back door and directed David inside. The tension was thick, hanging in the air like a storm cloud. David sat down in the seat, the handcuffs digging into his wrists, and looked out the window as the car pulled away from the parking lot. The city blurred by, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about the system he had dedicated his life to, the people he was responsible for protecting and serving. And he wondered, not for the first time, if this system would ever see him for who he really was. He wanted to see how far it would go. He wanted to feel all the shortcomings too. As Greg drove toward the station, the patrol car's engine hummed. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing. Something was wrong with this situation, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. David's gaze, calm, unshaken, didn't fit. Most people panic when they're arrested, but this man hadn't. Greg glanced in the rearview mirror. David sat silently, his face expressionless. This unsettled him. David's calm demeanor was extremely disturbing. No one could possibly be that relaxed, he thought. After all, he was a person being driven to the station in a police car. "What were you really doing in that park?" Greg asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. David looked into his eyes through the mirror. "I told you, I was working," he replied. Greg laughed sarcastically. "Working on what? Stolen documents?" he asked again. But it was obvious he was being condescending. David didn't answer. It was pointless. Greg had already made up his mind. To Greg, he was just a black criminal. As they approached the station, Greg's phone rang. He looked at the screen and saw a message from headquarters. His stomach clenched as he read it. "Check his ID. He may be a federal suspect." Greg's hands gripped the steering wheel. "Federal? Impossible." He looked at David in the mirror, his confidence shaken. But he couldn't back down now, not after making the arrest. After being humiliated so much, he wasn't ready to face that reality. They pulled into the station parking lot and Greg turned off the engine. He sat there for a while, staring at the steering wheel, then got out of the car. He opened the back door and helped David out, his movements not as confident as before. Whatever happened, he knew full well that such a truth would jeopardize his career. The atmosphere inside the station was tense. Officers were milling about in the hallways, their eyes drifting toward David as Greg led him to the processing desk. Sergeant Linda Hayes looked up from her paperwork, frowning as she assessed the situation. "What's going on, Sullivan?" she asked, her tone cautious. "Suspicious activity at Clearwater Park," Greg said, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. "Matches the description," he added. Linda narrowed her eyes. "And what is that description?" she asked. Greg hesitated. He didn't have a good answer. "Just a gut feeling," he offered tentatively. Linda sighed and shook her head. She had seen this before, police acting on preconceptions rather than evidence. She turned her attention to David, her expression softening. "Sir, may I have your name?" she asked politely. "David Harper," he answered calmly. "I'm a senior investigator with the FBI," he said. The room fell silent. All the officers within earshot turned to David, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Linda's face paled. Everyone looked at each other, wondering how Greg could have arrested someone like this. "The FBI?" she repeated, her voice slightly louder than a whisper. David nodded. "That's right. I'd appreciate it if you would remove these handcuffs," he requested politely. Whatever was happening, David remained calm. Linda's hands moved quickly to unlock and remove the handcuffs. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Harper. This is a mistake," she tried to explain. Greg froze, his face drained. He had just arrested a federal agent, a senior investigator. Realizing this shattered him. It was perhaps the biggest shock of his life. "I didn't know," Greg said in a trembling voice. "I thought," he tried to continue, but David cut him off sharply. "What did you think, Officer Sullivan? Did you think I was guilty because I was sitting in the park? Because I'm black?" he asked. Now all the cards were in David's hand. And everything was just beginning. What would you do if you were in David's place? Greg opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. He knew David was right. He knew his assumptions were based solely on prejudice. Linda stepped in, her voice firm but calm. "Mr. Harper, I can't apologize enough for what happened. This is unacceptable, and I assure you we will conduct a thorough investigation," she said, trying to defuse the situation and close the matter. David took a deep breath, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "An investigation won't change what happened, Sergeant, but maybe it will prevent the same thing from happening to someone else," he said. He had taken a clear stance against the treatment he had received, and he hated that treatment. To David, all people were equal. Skin color made no difference to him. Linda nodded seriously. "I promise," she replied. David turned to leave, but paused at the door. He looked at Greg, who was still standing there, his face showing shame and regret. "Officer Sullivan," David said quietly, "you had a choice today. You made the wrong choice. Learn from this," he said. With that, David left the station, leaving behind a room full of officers grappling with the weight of what had just happened. News of David Harper's arrest spread quickly through the station. Within hours, all the officers knew what had happened. Some were shocked, some went on the defensive, but all understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a public relations nightmare waiting to explode. Captain Rebecca Mills sat in her office, pressing her hands to her temples. The headache that had started an hour ago was now throbbing behind her eyes. The incident report sat on her desk. As she read it for the third time, the words blurred together. It was such a huge mistake that she was wondering what to do. She was furious. The incident report began as follows. Subject, David Harper. Position, Senior FBI Inspector. Charges, none. Status, released. No matter how you looked at it, this was a huge nightmare. She leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. This was bad, really bad. The knock on the door snapped her out of her thoughts. "Come in," she said in a tired voice. Sergeant Linda Hayes entered and closed the door. She had a serious look on her face. "Captain, we need to talk about Sullivan," she said. Rebecca nodded and gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Sit down, Linda. Tell me everything," she said, because she needed to understand everything that had happened and try to calculate the magnitude of the situation. Linda sat down, her hands clasped in her lap. Sullivan made the arrest based on what he called his gut feeling. He claimed the suspect matched the description of someone involved in recent thefts, but when I asked for details, he couldn't provide any concrete information. The fact is, there was no legitimate reason to stop him. Rebecca's jaw tightened. "So a racial profile was created," she said. This was the issue Rebecca found most problematic. Linda hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Captain. I think so," she replied. Rebecca closed her eyes, weighed down by the gravity of the situation. She had worked hard to build trust between the department and the community, but incidents like this threatened to undo years of progress. All that effort was going down the drain. "Where is Sullivan now?" Rebecca asked. "In the break room." "He knows he's in trouble," Linda said. Rebecca stood up, straightening her uniform. "Bring him to my office, right now," she ordered. Linda left the room, and a few minutes later, Officer Greg Sullivan entered. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he stood before Rebecca's desk. He looked like a man who knew his career was hanging by a thread. "Sit down," Rebecca commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. Greg sat down, his eyes fixed on the floor. He couldn't meet her gaze. He could already guess what was coming. "Do you realize what you've done, Officer Sullivan?" Rebecca asked, her voice cold and controlled. "You arrested a senior FBI inspector, a man who dedicated his life to protecting the law, and you did it based solely on your own prejudices," she charged. Greg flinched at the word prejudice, but he didn't argue. He knew Rebecca was right. He had arrested David entirely because of his skin color. He definitely had a prejudice against him because he was a black man. "I didn't mean to go that far," Greg said quietly. "I just thought I was doing my job," he continued. "Your job is to serve and protect," Rebecca snapped. "Not to harass innocent people because of their skin color. You violated Mr. Harper's rights and put the entire department at risk," she demanded. Greg's shoulders slumped. "I know. I'm sorry," he replied. "An apology isn't enough," Rebecca said, leaning forward. "Mr. Harper could sue. He could go to the media. And if he does, this department will come under scrutiny. Every decision we make, every arrest we make will be questioned. And it will all be because of you," she said. They were both aware of the magnitude of the situation. Greg raised his head, his eyes red. "What happens now?" he asked. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, a stern look on her face. "You are immediately suspended. There will be a formal investigation, and depending on the results, you could be fired. In the meantime, you will be required to undergo mandatory training on racial bias and de-escalation techniques," she replied. Greg swallowed hard and nodded slowly. "I understand," he said. "I hope you do," Rebecca said. "Because this isn't just about you, Officer Sullivan. It's about every person in this city deserving to be treated with dignity and respect. And if you can't do that, you don't deserve to wear that badge." Greg stood up, his movements very stiff. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Captain, whatever happens, I'm truly sorry," he said. Rebecca didn't respond. She just watched him leave and the door closed slowly behind him. Left alone in her office, Rebecca picked up her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. "David Harper." "Mr. Harper, this is Captain Rebecca Mills from the Clearwater Police Department. I wanted to personally apologize for what happened today," she said. There was a silence on the other end. "Thank you, Captain. But your apology doesn't change what happened," David replied. "I know," Rebecca said. "And I want you to know that we take this very seriously. Officer Sullivan has been suspended, and we are launching a full investigation into his conduct." "That's a start," David replied. "But the real problem isn't one officer. It's the culture that allows this kind of behavior to occur," he said. David wanted to change people's minds. Rebecca nodded, though he couldn't see her. "You're absolutely right. That's why I'm determined to make changes. We are implementing new training programs, increasing oversight, and working to rebuild trust with the community. But I know words aren't enough. We need results," she said. "I'm glad to hear that," David said. "Because this happens too often, Captain. And it's not just about me. Every black man, every black woman, every person of color has to live with the fear of being judged, stopped, or worse, simply because of their appearance," he said, speaking clearly on the subject. Rebecca's throat tightened. She had heard stories like this before, but hearing it from someone like David, who had dedicated his life to law enforcement, had a different effect on her. "I understand," Rebecca said quietly. "And I promise you, we will do better," she said. "I hope so," David replied. "Because society is watching us. And if this department doesn't change, it will lose what little trust it has left," he answered. After the interview, Rebecca sat quietly and looked at the phone in her hand. David's words echoed in her mind, a painful reminder of the work ahead. Over the next few weeks, the department underwent a transformation. New training focused on unconscious bias and community engagement was launched. Officers were required to attend workshops on de-escalation and cultural sensitivity. Captain Mills made it clear that officers who failed to meet the new standards would be held accountable. But change wasn't easy. Some officers resisted, arguing they were being unfairly targeted. Others questioned whether the reforms were necessary. Rebecca, however, stood firm and refused to back down. Meanwhile, David returned to his job at the FBI. She dedicated herself to her cases, using her experiences as fuel to fight for justice. But the incident at Clearwater Park never left her mind, reminding her of the world she lived in and the battles still to be fought. One afternoon, David was sitting in his office reviewing files when his phone rang. He looked at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number. "David Harper," he answered. "Mr. Harper, this is Captain Mills. I wanted to update you on the investigation." David leaned back in his chair. "I'm listening." "Officer Sullivan has been suspended," Rebecca said. "The investigation found clear evidence of racial profiling, and we determined his actions were incompatible with this department's values." David nodded slowly. "Thank you for letting me know." "There's more," Rebecca continued. "We've also established a civilian oversight committee to review complaints of misconduct. And we're working with community leaders to ensure our policies reflect the needs and concerns of the people we serve." A glimmer of hope appeared in David. "That's good to hear, Captain. Real change takes time, but it seems you're moving in the right direction." "We are," said Rebecca. "And I want to thank you, Mr. Harper. Your willingness to speak up, to hold us accountable, it made a difference." David smiled slightly. "I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." "It won't," Rebecca promised. "Not on my watch." When the call ended, David put down his phone and looked out the window. The city stretched out before him, bustling and vibrant. There was still much work to be done, many battles to be fought. But for the first time in a long while, he felt hope. Change was possible. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But it was possible, and that was enough to keep going. Months passed, and the reforms at the Clearwater Police Department began to take root. Officers who embraced the changes found themselves building stronger relationships with the community. Trust began to return, slowly but surely. David continued to work with the FBI, but he also began giving talks at police academies and community events, sharing his story and advocating for reform. He became the voice of those condemned to silence, reminding them that change was not only necessary but also achievable. One evening, as David walked through Clearwater Park, he stopped at the same bench where he had been arrested. The sun was setting, casting a warm light over the trees. He sat down and watched the peaceful scene. A black child, no older than 10, rode past on his bicycle, his laughter echoing through the park. David watched him, a slight smile appearing on his lips. This was why he had done it. This was why he had fought. So that child could grow up in a world where he was accepted for who he was, not judged by the color of his skin. David took a deep breath and felt a sense of peace wash over him. The struggle was not over, but progress was being made. And as long as there were people willing to stand up, raise their voices, and demand justice, there was hope. He stood up, dusted off his pants, and began walking toward the park exit. The city lights were beginning to glow, and the night air cooled his skin. As David walked, he thought about everything he had experienced, everything he had fought for. And despite the pain and disappointment, he realized he wouldn't change a thing. Because this was his purpose, this was his mission, and no matter what, he would continue to fight for justice.